everyone. Welcome back to the Anti-Hate Youth Collective podcast, where we discuss aspects of education, diversity, and inclusivity within Windsor-Essex. I'm your host and project coordinator of the Anti-Hate Youth Collective, Vanessa Blumenleg. This episode will be delving into racism in education, specifically the ways in which racism and discrimination perpetuate through educational methodology and proactive ways to engage students in anti-racism work and discussion in the classroom. Joining us here today to share her knowledge on racism is Dr. Natalie Delia, an anti-racism professor who has recently co-founded the Black Studies Institute at the University of Windsor and head of the Interdisciplinary and Critical Studies at the University of Windsor. Delia has been a critical advocate at the University of Windsor, showcasing her commitment to highlighting marginalized and racialized voices in Windsor-Essex. Dr. Delia, thank you so much for your time and commitment towards being such an advocate in Windsor-Essex.
My pleasure, Vanessa.
Could you tell us a little bit about what role institutions such as educational systems play in perpetuating and combating racism and hate?
We imagine that educational institutions have the capacity to end marginalization, to literally educate our community and our society out of these oppressive and violent mechanisms for destroying subaltern communities. We imagine that discrimination, prejudice, and racism are a function of ignorance. But the lived experience and the empirical evidence both work together to imply the exact opposite. White supremacy simply does not operate with a knowledge of itself as an oppressive force, but rather believes itself to be saving people of color, to be saving racialized and minoritized people from themselves. It is part of the logics of that colonial, racist, institutionalized supremacy. Because of this, education systems become one of the instruments, indeed a weaponized instrument, of replicating those existing oppressions. In its most essential form, public education, higher education in the global north are operated by white logics. And the process of being educated becomes the process of assimilating into and integrating those white logics, those white ways of knowing, as ipso facto goods. To be educated is to be more white proximate in its practice. And insofar as systems of education presume to evaluate, presume to grade, and it form the backbone of this illusion of meritocracy that gives one access to economic and social mobility. Public education systems are doing the violence themselves. When we evaluate students on their capacity to replicate and respond to what is important to white interests, white knowledge systems, and colonial frameworks, we're incentivizing that proximity and that capacity to mimic, and calling it smart and calling it worthy. One could say that that is one of the biggest violences of colonialism. And we can understand education systems as playing their part in what is effectively a cultural genocide of minoritized communities in the global north.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. A lot of the things that we discuss in class and we talk about with other individuals, specifically when I talk to minoritized individuals on campus, is the lack of replication within the educational system, being able to be represented. And sometimes I feel like I tell people all the time that I feel like it's very Eurocentric in nature, and that there's less of an importance on marginalized voices for sure. And one of the things I think that's intertwined with this too, specifically with media and relating it to how that contributes towards the way that we see individuals on campus. So I was wondering if you could delve in a little bit into what the role of media in playing and creating narratives surrounding racism in education in that kind of respect.
Absolutely, Vanessa. What a great question. The sociological literature shows us that media exists to reflect and then amplify existing public discourses. What that means in the lived experience is that if we believe something negative about a particular community, then media will reflect that, and then it will make it real in real time. Simply, if we have a negative stereotype about a particular racialized and gendered set of people, and then we see it in sitcoms, on the local news, and in film, then we're even more dug in to it's a normal, natural, and unavoidable way to view those bodies in those communities. And then we believe it more strongly in our day-to-day, which in an endless cycle of exclusion then gets reflected in those same media sources. On one hand, it is a responsibility of producers, artists, actors, journalists to stop those systems from replicating through their work, to refuse to be used as tools to replicate the existing power hierarchy. On the other hand, it's a giant cop-out on our part to say, actually, it's the fault of these individuals who should do better than we do. The ways in which media works to worsen the problem as opposed to solve it can't be underscored enough. But at the same time, simply saying that we should fix media is to pretend that media is what's starting that feedback loop, when in actuality, it's our willingness to buy in to what power holders in our society want us to understand about one another.
Yeah, I think I really resonated with the part that you're discussing about how media like influences. I know as a kid, I grew up, I'm half Filipino, half white, and I went to a very white predominant school in a well-off area. So um, one of the things that I actually wrote as a child, and I used to think it was hilarious, and now I'm very, very ashamed of it. And I actually won an award for it when I graduated grade school. Was how to be Asian. I wrote an article, and my teacher at the time thought it was like the funniest thing ever, and had like mentioned it to a bunch of other teachers, and it was all just stereotypical microaggressions that I have seen perpetuated in my life, thought that other people thought it was funny. So I wrote an article about it as like oh, this is my life, and like this is funny, and this is how I internalized everything and all the microaggressions that were held against me. And yeah, and it's one of those things where like I wasn't really represented in the media when I was a younger student, and like everything that I seen, it was kind of like, Asians are seen as, kind of like the funny, like the punch bag of a lot of jokes, and like the less seen of in that kind of respect in terms of media. So it's not funny, but to say, but it's interesting to see how I internalized that to showcase and make a fool out of myself, when actuality it was just the reality that I was living in.
It's its own particular type of racism for us to expect our children to be completely immune to the overwhelming weight of a supremacist narrative. Why in the world, right, would our 8-year-olds, our 10-year-olds, our 6-year-olds know better than what they are taught at school, what they are taught on television, what they are taught at the supermarket? Okay. Rather, they are normal children who learn and are socialized in the same exact way as everyone else in this society. What that means in terms of the self-loathing with which our children are inculcated is deeply shameful. And the ways in which part and parcel of that is learning to be ashamed of your parents and your people. I recognize, Vanessa, how upsetting winning an award for that type of, like, I'm so sorry. But what comes with that, to my mind, is far more unsettling. It's thinking that of your own family. What a tremendous victory for white colonial interests. And I mean, this is every day in our schools. This is what it is. I will never forget going to my son's kindergarten class to do the little volunteering when I was still into that. And there was a little girl, and she was phenotypically indigenous. If memory serves, she was of Guatemalan descent. But there were 73 million people in the Americas at the time that Christopher Columbus landed in Hispaniola. And the genocide that follows in the next 200 years, right, can be traced to Christopher Columbus. Again, these are larger global systems. But when that little girl came to me with her pretend boat drawing and was like, "Look, Miss Natalie, this is for Columbus Day. Isn't this great?" what are we doing to have a child celebrating the beginning of the genocide that killed her people with no knowledge at all? What do we do with that? Yeah, this is what it is.
Yeah, I like a lot of the things, the injustices I learned about in like my undergraduate. I did my undergraduate here at the University of Windsor. I very little learned about it, but even when I was in like grade school, I had never learned about the atrocities that happened. And I would say I'm pretty younger compared to a lot of people, and it's just interesting because they try to cover up like a lot of things, I think. And even with like I know people personally that are teachers, and there's not really much of a incorporation of wanting to move forward with that type of literature. And people always argue that people are too young for that and like that kind of thing, but it just never made sense, that argument, to me personally, to learn about that.
I always have difficulty finding the surprise and finding the confusion that many people express at the disparity between what is truth, whatever that is, and what we teach in the educational systems. The hidden curriculum of education is to make people complacent and to make them quiescent with existing power structures. You don't do that by talking about the atrocities that put those power structures into power, full stop. You do that by rendering, against all the odds, the murderers as heroes. And that is absolutely what our education system does. It is a feature, not a bug. And to think about that same institution as having the capacity to free us is, to my mind, a laughable endeavor.
Yeah, I think about it now, and like I feel like you personally, I'm not quite sure if there's anything that you could attribute or like add towards this, but specifically within your work and such, do you think that there's certain steps that educational institutions can take to decolonize their curriculum and like learning practices? Like, what are, if you can think of any recommendations or from your top knowledge?
So I've published fairly extensively on this question, right? And in the tradition of a pedagogy of the oppressed. And there's a juxtaposition in goals, right? And I believe them at this point in my life to be mutually exclusive. Though maybe in 30 years I'll see it differently, and I'm open to that as well. On one hand, we have bought into the idea that education opens doors, and so we need to open access to education. What that means is that we need to create some sort of assembly line for education, which means that we have to quantify. Once we start quantifying, we start measuring, we're back on the factory line. When we do that, we need clear deliverables. That is the opposite of the decolonization of knowledge. On one hand, in the way that we are doing education, end quote, in 2024, being like, learn something, do it good, right, is anathema. On the other hand, if we're decolonizing education, yeah, learn something, do it good. Right? I don't see how those two things can coexist. But people thrive holistically without the boxes that need to be checked off. At the same time, if you don't check off those boxes, you're not fulfilling the role of education in late capitalism, which is the content that they come for. I don't know how to resolve that tension.
Sure. I guess more towards learning about the application of anti-hate and anti-racism, specifically within classrooms, like leaning off of kind of what you built on. How can like universities or colleges or any type of institution that is responsible for educating create more inclusivity and understanding of different cultures and ethnicities on campus? How can we move towards including more marginalized voices?
On one hand, we live in Canada, we espouse collectively a multicultural ideology. So this devolves into Carnival of the Nations and the International Parade writ large. I love your food. Do I love your people? Here's what we have as a cultural attire. This is the most derivative vision of inclusion and really coexistence imaginable. The more we do Epcot Center style diversity events, the further we get from understanding that irrespective of culture, we're all driven by the same needs. We're all fundamentally the same people. That idea becomes revolutionary and deeply problematic to the way that we have education structured. If your lived experiences are just as worthy as my lived experiences, and your knowledges are just as important as my knowledges, then what do I have to teach you? How can I be superior to you? How can we know that I own good and you aspire to it? If we are all learners and all teachers, I mean, I can't even conceive of that. Those are really dangerous ideas. So we'll spend a lot of time doing creative nations. Did that answer the question, though?
It makes sense. I understand what you were trying to like go out with that for sure. I know you talked about approaching like teaching about racism and hate in your academic work. What strategies do you think that or that you employ personally to engage students in meaningful discussions about these topics?
One of the hardest parts of this is earlier K through or JK through grade 12 curriculum equates colorblindness with anti-racism. In that vision, as long as I don't say the words, they don't exist, and we're all fine. In Canada especially, there is no race, there is only culture, which is the opposite of the way that we live identity and perform embodiment. Insofar as my students spend 12 years learning that the best way to be anti-racist is to say things like, it doesn't matter whether you are green or purple, right? We all bleed the same red. How do you move past that? It's a really powerful, willful ignorance. It's inculcated when people are really impressionable. I find that most of the success isn't just naming it. And then people do a reasonably good job. But even to that effect, you can't educate people out of racism. I think that I understand success as just the troubling of existing notions. I can't presume to fix anyone.
I think a lot of times too, specifically with like me trying to explain a lot to like a lot of my white colleagues, is like something that I always feel guilty is trying to educate other people. And I realize that like a lot of people say that, you know, like, why it's not my job to educate you and like that kind of thing. And I, like, for me personally, it's just hard to kind of explain and like relate to a lot of people, specifically because I talked about this in class where it's like, to some people I'm white, to some people I'm a minority, and it's hard to like break between that, where sometimes me giving my experience or like my lived experiences contradicts other people's idea of like a minority, for an example, saying, oh, well, you don't have it that hard, or like, you know, like you have it better than other people, and like kind of discrediting me in that kind of way. And I understand that like my white identity, I get a lot of privilege with that, with being ambiguous that way. But like I know a lot of times when I try to discuss on that, it's like, well, your lived experiences aren't like as valid, or you know, a lot of people how they based on perceive me. So I think it's interesting to talk to different people about that specifically, because some people I'm a minority, to some people I guess I'm not. So
I think people find it difficult to wrap their minds around the idea of, one, spectrums of inequality, and two, I say this in a derogatory way, insofar as we're playing oppression Olympics, that's to no one's good end. We exist in a particular space and lived experience. The reality of the matter for me is that for every dollar that a white man makes, I make 57 cents. So she must hustle. Also, simultaneously, there are 100 women who look exactly like me, who are no better and no worse than me, that work twice as hard for half the pay. Both of those things are happening at the same time. On one hand, I am demonstrably disadvantaged on the same spectrum, and it's like literally it's going on concurrently. I am so privileged. we all exist somewhere in there. How do we hold the both?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do honor to one while not disregarding the other?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the biblical Job. That is, I'm not derogatorily the winner of a dark oppression Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
That said, we have the right to make claims on our own behalf.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly with phenotypical and or cultural proximity to whiteness, we have a degree of access and privilege,
Mm-hmm.
while at the same time being excluded from unidimensional white privilege. Certainly with some base vocabulary, we can collectively wrap our minds around that level of complication. But it is a level of complication.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly the biggest beneficiaries of positive discrimination programs, affirmative action programs, are white women. The reality is that gender is racialized and race is gendered. To think that white women are fundamentally oppressed, right, without acknowledging that their racial position puts them in a position of power, is to be, I would argue, willfully ignorant. Historically, women of color broadly, right, are absolutely, right, rendered inferior to white women. I can't imagine another way of seeing these identities, seeing these embodiments. That said, to conflate the experiences of East Asian women with South Asian women, with Black women, that is also nonsensical. Right? And there are different spaces of the rendering subservient, but it's also not monolithic, right? Like, West Canada looks different than East Canada, and what the body means in different spaces is different. All of that said, the day that you sell me on that there is too much voice by Asian women in public spaces in this country, I may have been born at night, but it was not last night, Vanessa.
Yes.
My response, I think, okay, but actually I'm going to tell you what my response would be, but this is disingenuous. Right? Because my response as Natalie, who's not an Asian woman, right, and who's socialized very differently. But my response in this imagined reality, right, is, oh, you have a suggestion for how we can be even more invisible? Please, say more. But the only reason that I say that I would say that is because I'm socialized to be the witty, hostile sidekick. And the fact of the matter is that if I were phenotypically Asian, I would likely say nothing. And that's its own whole set of assumptions. Because also the reality is that the same person probably would not have said the analogous to me.
Yeah, there's some things that people will say to me where it's like, if I was literally anyone, you would never say that to me. It was weird because I feel like a lot of times people ask me for my lived experience and like they talk a lot about it, but then it's almost like in a questioning kind of way where it's not like they genuinely want to know. It's more of like a questioning, like, oh, why are we doing this? And it's like, well, I don't want to speak on behalf of the masses because I'm just one individual, but that's also, it was very, very, caught me off guard, so to speak. So, yeah.
We're all socialized in different ways. And I mean, I would make the argument that everything that we say, every behavior that we engage in, right, it's not just about the things that we're doing, which comes from our socialization, but it's about the relational space. So the way that I talk to you is different than the way that I, for example, speak to my boss. Does that mean that I'm a different person? Kind of, but what a limiting way to see it. Right? We all constantly code switch, right? And that's relational. The space that I normally find myself, right, when in conversation with Anglos, but especially Anglo women, right, is the expectation is that I exist to uplift them, but in a very active way. So what is writ onto the embodiment is not submissiveness per se, but I should be, helping them to cook, helping with the kids, cleaning something for them, generally affirming. Right? That's what Hollywood says. That's what the news say. That's what the news says. And that's what 500 years of socio-political history say. So that's the expectation. That is not quite the same as silence. And I'm not actually supposed to be invisible. That is an affront.
Mm-hmm.
I'm supposed to be useful.
Yes.
The way that they would speak to you, they capital T, right? It's an imagined they.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. And I, in the context of this conversation, I find it really, really disingenuous to be like, well, what I would say, because none of this would happen.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. I 100% agree, and I appreciate your input on regarding that for sure. And I guess kind of like my ending question for you, I know you do a lot of work on campus, and you've been, like I said, we talked about this before, such an assistance to the University of Windsor and being able to advocate for marginalized and racialized voices, specifically students. Why do you continue to be so passionate and motivated with advocacy, specifically in your work, your personal life?
Vanessa, the body can never be neutral. The decision to do nothing is a decision. Mm-hmm. And it resonates and it's super powerful. Mm-hmm. When you do nothing, you're complicit. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to know this. You've probably heard this story. It's like a really animating story for me. Mm-hmm. There were some white male students that were being vaguely disrespectful in a class that I was teaching, right? That was majority women of color. And I was tired and I was annoyed and I let something go. It was a small thing, but I let it go. Mm-hmm. And I dismissed class 4 minutes later. Not today, Satan. So one of my students, African-American woman, comes up to me after class and she's like, I thought you liked me. And I was like, I do like you. I don't get the question. And she was like, if you liked me, why did you let that go? And I was like, it's trifling. It wasn't even a big deal. It was a small deal. Mm-hmm. I was like, sometimes you just have to turn the other cheek. Like, you cannot do everything. Mm-hmm. And she said, that's interesting because you just let it go. So when I see him in 10 years at work and he disrespects me like that, I'm going to have to put him in his place. And his response will be, but Dr. Delia didn't mind. So, like I said, I thought you liked me. It is so annoying to be a grown woman. It is so much. Mm-hmm. Letting something go makes you complicit. It passes it down the line and makes it worse. And it creates division such that the person that actually does the work of saying something is the outlier who is being too sensitive. I can't sign off on that. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes I'm tired and sometimes I'm cranky. And if you know me as a person, I am not a 10 out of 10 person. That said, every day. Because y'all have to live in this world.
That's very strong. And yeah, I agree. Like, sometimes I feel like when I don't even stick up for things that I need to, future me, especially as a kid, like when I used to let things like what I talked about earlier, like trickle down, like I feel responsible almost to my own racism. Like, you know what I mean? It's just, and it's just sad because I used to think it was such an amazing accolade, and now I look back on it, especially with what I'm doing here at the university, I'm embarrassed by it, so.
Can I say something about embarrassment, which is just a euphemism for shame? And I want to be really clear that I'm not just talking about embarrassment. You're embarrassed for something that you did. You're ashamed for something that you are or were. Embarrassment doesn't last longer than a week or so. Sometimes I just wish they would leave our kids alone. You have no shot at all. None. Not before you're 10, not before you're 15, not before you're 25. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I'm not sure I have a shot right now. To hold yourself responsible for being victimized by a globally powerful ideological movement? Mm-hmm. Too much. Most days we win, some days we lose. Doing the best that we can.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Delia, for taking your time to be here and to talk about this. I think, like, once again, it's important conversation to have. I know we interviewed other marginalized students on campus about their experiences. So thank you so much again for being here. Um, so that's it for the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in with us here today. If you'd like to follow us on Instagram, our Instagram handle is at We Anti Hate Youth Collective. I'm so excited for the rest of the podcast to be released. So stay tuned for more information and take care as always.